Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Very sorry, got the sun glaring through my window at the moment, but welcome to a film review. This is kind of apt really about today's film, which is I class as a nuclear horror film, and it's called Threads. Now this was made by the BBC and was aired in the 1980s. I'll tell you a little bit of information about the film. I don't know if the video will get out because BBC tend to block everything that you ever do, so we'll see. Okay, Threads. It's a UK film, filmed in 1984, runs for 112 minutes, 15 certification, directed and written by Barry Hines, starring Karen Mahinga and Rhys Dinsdale. Cinematography is by Andrew Dunn. Now, there's no music in the film, so I can't tell you done the music because there isn't any. So this is based in Sheffield, in Yorkshire. Obviously, I live in Yorkshire, but I'm West Yorkshire, and Sheffield is South Yorkshire. And it's based on a nuclear attack on Sheffield in the 1980s. Now, the film is sort of based out where we get to meet two sort of central characters in the film called Jim and Ruth. And you tend to meet them at the beginning of the film, and they're sort of like high up on sort of like the hills of Sheffield, looking over across Sheffield. And they're talking about, the girl's talking about how beautiful the countryside is and stuff like this. But on the radio, there's all this news going on about problems happening in Iran. But he switches radio stations to the football news, and then they sort of like go on with their sort of date, whatever they're doing. And the whole film plays out following these two youngsters. And in amongst this, we see clips of other people living their lives, daily lives. And in the background, you've got this newscast going over, like a radio, telling you what's happening in Iran and all the problems that are happening there. And TV reports. And then the Russians getting involved with it. And all this sort of thing, and all these sort of like things that look tension building up. And while this is happening, we catch up with Jim and Ruth, and Ruth finds out she's pregnant, and so we then get her and Jim sort of coming to terms of becoming quite young and pregnant. And then we get to see her families. All the families meet each other. Ruth's family meets Jim's family and all this because they want to keep the baby and get married and all this sort of thing. So we see all this sort of playing out in the background of these news reports. And some of the film is narrated over as well. And also you get like typewriter print across the film telling you information. At the beginning we get told about Sheffield, how popularity is and what it is for industry, and that there's a NATO base not far outside of Sheffield. And then we sort of hear news reports of the conflict sort of like getting worse, and then the Americans are then sticking their nose in and at Russia, saying if you carry on, we're going to get involved, and in this sort of thing all going on in the background. So then the conversation between people, not just Jim and Ruth, because we do meet other people in the film. We meet their family, we meet their friends, but we also see strangers shopping around the shops and all this sort of thing. And all the talk around it is about the war and people starting to worry. And then it really kicks off at the war, and we see the Americans start attacking the Russians and Iran. And so then that sort of escalates, and then sort of a submarine goes missing and stuff like that in the sea. And that's all kicking off. So all these people in the UK are very, very worried because they've also decided to use the NATO base as an air base for the American airplanes. And obviously, being in Yorkshire, we're close to the North Sea, so there's the oil refineries out in the sea and stuff like this. So all these sort of things make it a bit of a target. And Sheffield being quite a high industry, especially with steel at the time, would also be a target. So all these people getting worried, and Jim's carrying on with his he keeps bird keeping, and him and Ruth decide to get a little flat together for them and the baby, and all this sort of stuff happens and going on, and then on the TV they start receiving public information films about what to do if there's an attack on the country, an airstrike, or things like this, or this sort of duck and cover sort of information sort of films coming out. And they seem to be prevalent wherever you go. There seems to be information about, taking down your doors, building like a shelter, and if you've got a cellar, secure your cellar, put food down there. And then you start seeing people going around sort of panic buying, a bit like COVID, and they're all panic buying. All the shops are becoming empty. So this task force that are formed by normal people, that are all part of this task force, that in a state of crisis get together to try and form some sort of local democracy. So we see the main guy of that sort of going down underneath the town hall into the basement with other people, starting to arrange things for democracy, like protecting the fuel, food, etc., like this, and all this sort of stuff going on. And by this time, we're about 45 minutes into the film, and all this sort of stuff is still going on. And then we join the film on one Saturday afternoon, and everything's going about its normal business, and then bam, a nuclear attack happens. First at the North Sea, just away in the air above the sea, and it sort of destroys a lot of the oil refineries, and it destroys a lot of the communications between Britain and the rest of Europe. It all seems to have been cut off by this attack. And then just minutes afterwards, that one was an 80 megaton bomb. A few minutes afterwards, a 300 megaton bomb is dropped on Sheffield. And we see the explosion, and then we start seeing some of the sort of like effects of the explosion and everything coming to disarray. And then all of our cast, all the parents, Jim, Ruth, and that all get separated because they're all in different places at the time. And we tend to pick up with some of them along the way. So then after the explosion, the film sort of like concentrates and breaks it down to like day 1 after explosion, day 2, day 7, like this. And we see the sort of like, and then we get the narrations about the fallout and the aftermath of this explosion and what happens like weeks afterwards, months afterwards, years afterwards. And we see all these, and we catch up in like 2 or 3 days after the explosion with the two families, Ruth's and Jim's. So we see Jim's family in their house, and they've built like a little shelter with the doors, but the wife's face is all burnt up. She's got half a head of hair, and the husband's coughing up, probably from the fallout and stuff like this. And they're living in this tiny little thing, a bit like when the wind blows. They've built that sort of shelter, and then they find the body of the young boy of the family. They find that his body in the house, dead, and their health just deteriorates and deteriorates, and then eventually throughout the film, the wife dies. And the man sort of goes off on his way. We do catch up with him a bit later in the film because he's still actually alive at the time. And then we see Ruth's family, and they've got a basement, so they've gone down to the basement with Ruth's grandmother, and Ruth is with them, and obviously she's in a pregnant state, and they're doing okay in that basement. But eventually the grandmother dies, and so they have to move her body out of the basement. And when they do that, Ruth gets out and she goes out and starts walking around. Now, this is supposed to be like about a month or so after the job. She goes out on her own. The parents don't try to stop her because they know there's no point, they can't. So they go back down to the cellar. But later on in the film, her family also come to their demise, but they get murdered by looters. Because otherwise they would have probably survived. But they get looted and they get killed for a tin of peaches or something like that. And then sort of like we catch up with Ruth and her story of like dealing with the pregnancy and all this and giving birth and trying to survive. And then she comes across one of Jim's friends that she'd met, and they sort of become friends a little bit, and they try to survive in the wild, but he goes off on his own way and she's left on her own. And then she has her baby later in the film and all this sort of stuff. And we then see all the rest of the population, and we're getting information of how it's all changing, how the sky's changed, and how we're getting fallout, acid rain, and people now starting getting radiation poisoning and dying of different illnesses and stuff like this, and all this kind of thing, and while the government are holding back on the food supplies and stuff like this, as they probably would. And then we see sort of riots breaking out. We're seeing sort of soldiers and police shooting people on the spot that are sort of like looting houses or rummaging for food. All this sort of chaos is going on. And then we catch it goes like 10 years later, and Ruth and her baby, who's now like a 10, 11-year-old, grown up. But Ruth has cataracts problem. She's lost her eyesight over the years of the contamination, and Ruth dies. And then we sort of follow her daughter for a little bit, who also becomes pregnant, and she goes off on a little story. We don't see Jimmy anymore in the film, so we have to take it that Jimmy died. But we do see his dad a bit later in the film. He's like at a workplace where the farming sort of thing, and he's like still alive, and so that's the only bit we see of him. And the film just goes on all about the devastation on the population of Britain, saying that it pretty much in about 10 years' time, Britain would be pretty much back into a medieval state, where the population of Britain would be between 4 and 8 million people. So it's gonna, so many people are just dying, and babies being born deformed, and all this sort of thing. And it's shocking. It's an absolutely shocking film. But it's great. It's a really good film. Really enjoyed it. The pluses of it, now, it is quite dated. They have remastered it. This is a 2-disc edition. Now, the first disc comes with a remastered from the BBC prints and a couple of audio commentaries. The disc 2 is the director's approved widescreen edition, which is the edition I watched. Sorry, what I watched. And then there's a load of documentaries and interviews with cast and documentaries about the film. It's a really good set. It's really cool. 2 discs. The acting is believable because it's made like a documentary. It's almost like a documentary, and you're seeing clips of people of that time having chat, and like you get the Ruth and Jimmy, but it's almost filmed like a little drama, and the families and their relationships, but just to give you some sort of like normal life. But the rest of it's filmed like a documentary, where we get news clips on the TV, we get like pictures of military actions, and then we get obviously the bomb being dropped, and then we get all the post-apocalyptic information. And it's a very, very depressing movie. I'm going to score the film an amazing watch and give it a 9 out of 10. It's not a 10 out of 10 film because it's the subject matter is so depressing and so like at the moment prevalent with what's going on in the world. We've got problems in the Middle East. We've got problems with Russia and Ukraine, and this threat ever seems more dormant now than it did in the 80s. In the 80s, when we went through the Cold War sort of time, this sort of thing was all over the place. There was imminent, like a Russian attack's going to happen. Because Britain being closer to Russia than America, we're more in the fire line, if you like. But it was, it was daunting at the time. I remember seeing it back in the 80s, and I was absolutely terrified by it. I thought, is this really happening? Is this really real? Because I thought it was real. And, I thought half of Britain was being blown away. I was really young, you see, and I thought Sheffield had now been destroyed. Actually, when you go there, it sometimes looks like it. But, because I work there, so, but anyway, it was it was kind of devastating, and it's still a hard-hitting documentary now. It has aged a lot, but I think it's a really important piece of film, and I think this should be shown in schools and things like that, and should be used as education and as students doing them as theses and stuff like that. I think it's really important to learn from this, just like we tried to learn from the World War II and the Holocaust and things like this. This is another sort of documentation to try and learn from, although this is not true, but it is in a way. This kind of thing happened at the end of World War II in Japan, so they went through this. So and this is like this was almost like a warning film when it came out. It felt like that. And I think it's still relevant today, and I think it should be shown around and educate. I think the BBC should be showing it on their channel and stuff like this. Not to scaremonger people, but to educate people, to see how far we've come. I mean, in now you got to think we've probably got a bit better chance of survival because we have technologies, and you know how knowledge has grown from this time, and I'd hope we would. But us, the average man, not a chance. Not a chance. There's no bunkers built anywhere. There's no survival plans in places anywhere. But obviously the government will have that. But for us, we've got no chance. So it will be like this, a free for all. But definitely worth watching if you get the chance. That's Threads, 9 out of 10. And if you guys seen it, if you have, let me know down below what you think of it. It is a real sort of harsh horror film, and it is a sort of like post-nuclear horror film. It deals with just normal everyday people all of a sudden being hit by a nuclear explosion about stuff that's got nothing to do with them. Somebody else's problem, somebody else's war. A war that's out in Iran has affected Sheffield in Yorkshire. You see, and that's the horror of the film. These people, nothing to do with what's going on out there. You know, nothing. They're just living their lives with their families and stuff like that. And that's the true horror of war. Guys, till my next video, please check out some horror channels. Check out Horror Hands, Horror Geek, Man v Film, RS Designs, Pizzawell. I'm Ice Lord, Cat Watches Horror Movies, Grumpy Andrew's Haunted House. And a massive shout out to my lad. Till next time, look after yourselves, look after one another, and I really hope I see you all soon.